In this video, I'm going to share with you 9 unconventional tips to get super sharp photos. I'm Tin Manley, a full-time wildlife photographer. In just the last few years, my students have won over 300 national and international awards. So these tips may be unconventional, but it works for my students. So tip number 1. A few years ago, I had a chance to talk to legendary National Geographic photographer Michael Nichols in Yellowstone National Park. He said that in his career, he mostly shoots wide open and he shoots prime lens because as long as the eyes of the subject, be it the bird or the wildlife, as long as their eyes are sharp, humans' perception, our viewers, when they see the photos, their feeling is that the photo is sharp. So we have to understand how humans react to a photo before we can create photos that makes them feel that it is super sharp. As long as the eyes are sharp, and the more unsharp the other areas in the images, actually makes the eyes look sharper. And if the eyes is sharper, the feeling is that the whole image is sharper. And if Michael Nichols, he has won the Wildlife Photographer of the Year and he has made so many National Geographic covers. It is definitely something that we should learn from the master. Tip number 2. So there is something that I believe it for many years. You know, the camera manufacturers and a lot of the lab tests, they don't tell you one thing, is that wildlife and birds, they never stay still in bright light like in a studio for you to take photos. So in reality, a lot of them are elusive, they are skittish, they blend well into the background, and they're active in dawn and dusk in low light. So getting a sharp photo of them is completely different than those lab tests. Imagine there is a hawk in front of you on a perch and the hawk is gonna take off. Or if there is a leopard in the tall grass going to leap onto a Thompson gazelle, right? What is the most important thing about getting great sharpness in those photos is the ability to lock the focus as quickly as possible, meaning that there is as little delay as possible before the camera grab onto the focus. For example, if the bird is right here and then it's gonna take off, and if there is any delay in the time when it lock focus, the bird is already there when you take the photo. So there will be a miscalculation of the focus, and that's causing the photos to not to be sharp. So you want to have as little autofocus lag as possible to get a sharp photo. So how do we get that? For example, especially in low light conditions, pre-dawn or after dusk, in those conditions, the amount of light that comes through the lens onto the camera determines how fast the autofocus is. So if you let in more light, the autofocus will be faster. So a f2.8 lens is gonna focus a lot faster than a f4 lens, and an f4 lens is gonna focus a lot faster than an f5.6 lens. So even if you have a 100 to 500 f7.1 like the Canon lens, the lab shows you that the files are very sharp, but the autofocus speed is gonna be a lot slower than the prime lens, a 402.8. So with that delay, that would cause the image to be not as sharp. In bright light, it doesn't really make such a difference. However, what I learned is that the best photos, the photos that really evoke the most emotion, depends a lot on how you use the light. Like the more dramatic the light is after sunset when the sky is purple, you know, those would actually create a lot more emotion. So if you get a photo that is really sharp but it doesn't evoke any emotion, that is useless, right? So I would definitely recommend you to try to get a lens that is fast, like a 2.8 and f4 lens. So tip number 3, now that you know the importance of getting a super sharp photo is to reduce this autofocus lag. And one of the best ways to help the camera to reduce this lag is actually before you even click on the shutter, you look into the field and try to find a background that is clean, that the background is a lot further away from the animal, so that when the camera is trying to look for the subject, it's a lot easier to find instead of all these distracting tree branches and leaves, because those will confuse the camera. And with all this computation, it will actually slow it down. So for me, I wouldn't even click on the shutter until I find a very clean background. And because of that, the photos turn out to be a lot sharper because of that reduction on the autofocus lag. So tip number 4 is be aware of the heat shimmer. For example, during sunrise, when the sun comes out, like all the water vapor is coming out and it's in between the animal and your camera. And because of that, the camera would not be able to focus accurately. And that's what we call the heat shimmer. So when it happens, it is very difficult to avoid. Photographer Steve Perry had a YouTube video about removing the lens hood. I think that is a wonderful idea, and I have the link down below. When we shoot backlit, usually there will be a lot of flare and glare, so you actually need lens hood to reduce that. Or if you are shooting in the rain, right, so you also need the hood. So what I suggest is try to go earlier in the day or stay even later when the temperature difference is a little bit less. The heat shimmer effect will be reduced. I still remember one year I was in Yellowstone and these coyotes were coming pretty close. The sun was shining on the snow and the water vapor was coming up. There's severe heat shimmer and there's just nothing you can do. All the photos were not sharp. Topax denoise AI can help a little bit when you have the heat shimmer. Tip number 5, a lot of people are not gonna like me on that. So my advice is to shoot as low ISO as possible. So when I first started photography, I learned from a lot of the professionals who told me that these days the camera technology is so good that at ISO 1600, 3200, there's no noise. So you can just use that as a default to begin shooting at ISO 1600, and as the light goes down, you just go up from the ISO. And I was doing that for many years and I got sharp photos and it seems to be nice and sharp with a lot of details. But there were a few times when by accident I was shooting at a much lower ISO, like at ISO 400 or 100. And the result blew me away. I see so much more details, the photos look a lot sharper. And that's when I realized that there's an MTF curve, right? At the lower ISO, the file has a much higher dynamic range and the image would look a lot sharper. Ever since then, I would always look into the ISO. Over the last few years, I have some chance to talk to some of the top photographers who I admired. They were selling limited edition prints at a very high price and they were doing exhibits. And all of them whom I talked to, they use low ISO. So there must be a reason behind that. While we are talking about the low ISO, so the shutter speed. So before I would be using very high shutter speed because I'm really into sharpness, right? So the higher shutter speed is supposedly you get sharper photos, but in reality, all you need to know is the minimum shutter speed to get a sharp photo, because if you increase shutter speed more than that, it really doesn't make a difference. The higher shutter speed, the higher ISO you need to use. For example, if animals are walking, like a lion is walking, I will use 500 of a second. And if they are running, then 800 of a second. If they are pouncing, then 1250 of a second. And for birds, if they are not like super fast birds like swallows or puffins, then just try it, give it a try and check out your photos by zooming in, like 1600 of a second, 2000 of a second, but you don't need to go for 4000 of a second. So tip number 6, get the highest pixel camera as possible and go for full frame. I still remember when I was at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History at a Nature's Best Photography exhibition. There were 40 photos in display that year, but 3 of the photos really stood out. And all 3 photos, they were using cameras that had more than 45 megapixels. And then I really researched into that. And I realized that if you are doing a print, the photos with higher pixels definitely would help. Also, one of the things that is very important for high megapixel camera is if you are sharing your photos online, like in Facebook, Instagram, or you're submitting to a photo contest, they usually require an image of 2000 pixels for the first round, right? And there is a method for image sharpening. I think it was started by landscape photographer legend Mark Adamus. If you have an image that has like 8,000, 9,000, to do sharpening is you don't resize it into 2,000 pixels and then you apply sharpening. What he learned is that you can apply sharpening at the original file size, but you over sharpen it to a level that makes the image looks really over sharpened, and then you resize to 2,000 pixels. The image would look a lot sharper. So that really gives you an edge when you are submitting the contest, you're sharing. The photos would always look sharper. So tip number 7 is don't underexpose your photo. So make sure that, especially in low light condition, you actually want to overexpose the photo, because when a photo is too dark, and in post-processing, when you bring up the shadow area, you brings up a lot of noise. Once you bring up the noise, the signal to noise ratio is a lot smaller, so the image would look a lot less sharp. When it's bright, when it's a lot of lights, it doesn't really matter. But if you remember the last few points, I highly recommend you to try to shoot in low light conditions, sunrise, sunset, and those, because the photos would come out much better. And in order to learn about underexpose and those, I have a video about exposure and metering theory that I'll put in the link below. But with cameras like Sony, they have something called the zebra, which really shows you when the overexposure happens. And also with the other cameras, you also have the real-time histogram in the electronic viewfinder, where you can check out and make sure that the histogram is towards the right hand side so that you're not underexposing the photo. Tip number 8. So if I were able to convince you to get the prime lens, for example, the 400 f2.8, my favorite, or the 600 f4 or 500 f4, I would highly recommend you, if financially available, to get the newest lens, because the newer lenses, they are a lot lighter. And if you have the same 400 2.8, one is heavier, one is lighter. The lighter one, you can always hand hold it longer with less shake. The firmer you can hold the lens, the sharper photos you can get. So that's what I would do. And you may say, hey, but Tin Man, I use a tripod or monopod for my heavy lenses. Well, I don't really use tripod or monopod because it slows me down. Much more important thing is to previsualize, right? Without disturbing them, of course, but get into a position with a better background is much better than sticking a tripod to get a sharper photo when the background and the composition doesn't work. As you know, I no longer use tripod, so that's why the tripod is a decoration for me now, even though I spent $2,000 for that one. Tip number 9 is, when you have these new cameras, I would always try to shoot at the highest frame rate possible. So some of the people will say, I'm just gonna use the mechanical shutter and shoot it at like 5 frames per second because it takes a lot of time to delete photos later. But if you're paying that much money for a camera that has the capability to shoot 10 frames, 20 frames per second, or 30 frames per second, I would shoot for the highest frame rate, because when you are focusing on a bird or an animal, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the camera to lock focus. So when you press the shutter, maybe the first 1 or 2 photos, the camera is still in the process of locking or tracking the focus. But if you take a blast of 10, 15 photos all at once, sometimes maybe the 4th or the 5th one is actually the sharpest, because those were the moments when the camera really lock onto focus, and then it will lose focus again, and then it will grab again. So you just never know. But if your camera is capable of getting so many frames all at once, just shoot it. So nothing is more painful when you realize that none of your photos in the sequence is sharp than deleting 49 photos, but you have this once a lifetime shot of the 50th photo that is super sharp. So always shoot at the highest frame rate. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed this, I'm sure that you enjoy another video. Right here is 7 mistakes that every beginning photographers make. Definitely check it out, and I'm not gonna repeat some of the tips from some very good photographers who talk about this topic in YouTube. So definitely check out the links down below. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, and if you have any comments or questions, I'm more than happy to discuss with you. So leave your comment down below, and I'll see you in the next video.